Every generation gets one great comic book game. I'm talking about a genre-defining comic game. And whenever we do get one, it shines so bright that it makes the more mid-comic games look like shit. Stop for a second and think about it. How many good superhero games are there versus how many comic games there are? Good games are rare, and some games just disappear from the market never to be seen again. Games that fans love, like Marvel Heroes Omega or Avengers Alliance. Games that are just doomed to be lost to time. I've made more than a few tweets knocking the current state of comic book games, and I think a few of those might have rubbed people the wrong way. So I'm gonna explain my cynicism and why I think comic games are the way they are. Well, the easy answer is money, but I think it's deeper than that. The Bible says money is the root of all evil, but I think that's only half of it. The money is just a tool. It's how you get it and what you do with it that counts. And when you play money games in predatory, manipulative ways, when you cheat the system or take advantage of legal loopholes, or when you try to play mind games with your customers, then try to gaslight them into thinking they're the ones at fault for something you did, that's Moneyball. And that's the true root of all evil. I'm gonna explain how all this connects to Squad, Gotham Knights, Avengers, and Spider-Man 2, but first we need to go over how we got here. What's the deal with all the influencer skins in Spider-Man 2? And why are the default skins in games like Avengers always so ugly compared to the DLC skins that you buy with real money? And why are mobile games focusing so hard on loot boxes, microtransactions, and gambling mechanics? Especially when you consider that most of these things are made for kids. It feels like every comic game that comes out is just more live service slop. They've completely forsaken single-player story-driven narratives like Spider-Man just so they can make more multiplayer live service crap like Avengers. They want to monetize the console games in the same way they monetize the mobile games. So to explain why the console games are the way they are, we've got to look back at the mobile games and why they are the way they are. So first we're talking about 2012's Avengers Alliance. Now Avengers Alliance was a Facebook game, kind of like Mafia Wars or Farmville, and those Farmville Facebook games were the first games to really embrace that microtransaction loot box model in the same way that modern mobile games do. And Avengers Alliance was no different. It's really the patient zero of these things. It was actually the first Marvel game to coin the term ISO 8, which is still what a lot of Marvel mobile games call their in-game funny money to this day. So basically, without Avengers Alliance, you don't get Marvel Future Fight or Contest of Champions or Marvel Snap. None of those games would exist the way they do if it wasn't for Avengers Alliance being the trendsetter. It taught Marvel a formula that they could repeat over and over again. So Marvel made all this multiplayer slop, but out of all of those games, Marvel Heroes Omega was probably the most beloved by fans. People didn't mind the loot box stuff just because the game was that good. But then the game got shut down and disappeared from the market back in 2018. And I have a theory as to why that is. So Star Wars Battlefront 2 dropped in late 2017, and that game was packed to the brim with microtransactions and loot boxes. It was so bad that countries across the EU started regulating gambling mechanics in kids games just because of Star Wars Battlefront 2. Because of that, EA ended up taking all the loot boxes out of Battlefront 2 altogether. And a little while after that, Marvel Heroes Omega was quietly removed from the market. My theory is that Disney took loot boxes out of all their console games, but for whatever reason, they didn't take them out of the mobile games. And the microtransactions didn't go anywhere either. They just made it so that the skins in Marvel's Avengers were more expensive to compensate for the fact that you didn't have to gamble for them anymore. The metadata for Marvel's Avengers actually shows that there were going to be loot boxes in the game at some point, but then in the middle of development they were removed, which, if I had to guess, is probably because of Star Wars Battlefront 2. But the fact that was the intention explains a lot about Marvel's Avengers. Specifically, it explains why they make the default skin so ugly on purpose. That way it would incentivize you to buy one of the cooler looking skins. And honestly, the Moneyball logic of all this stuff is just so desolate. It makes games feel less like an escapist fantasy that I'm playing, and more like a series of chores that I have to get around to doing. I don't feel like Spider-Man anymore. I don't feel like Batman anymore. These games just make me feel like a baked potato that's plugged into the Matrix. But that's the point of how these dopamine loops work. You start off like getting the bird in between the pipes is impossible, and then that becomes, wow, I'm so good at doing the hard thing. It's a validation loop. The same reason people liked Flappy Bird is the same reason they like Dark Souls. It tricks them into thinking that they're good at something or that they accomplished something, and that makes them want to do it again. And that's because of the way that dopamine gets released inside of your brain. It creates a reward and validation simulacrum, which is a big part of why people love World of Warcraft. In real life, they might be in mom's basement, but in World of Warcraft, they're the god of the guild. The same reason people get hooked on WoW is the same reason people get hooked on gambling. That easy dopamine rush, it gives them the illusion of control. It makes them feel like winners. Casinos prey on people who are vulnerable and desperate enough to fall victim to those illusions. And so do video games. Every time Sonic gets a ring or Mario gets a coin, that sound effect conditions you like Pavlov's dog to want to do it again. So game developers mix the logic of gambling and addiction to keep you hooked on multiplayer games. It's Mad Men advertising logic. There's a really good book called The He-Man Effect that really goes in depth on the origins of this stuff and how it all works on a deeper level. But to tie it back to video games, game development stops being about building a good game and it starts being talking about building a good casino. It's not about making you feel like Batman anymore. It's about making you want more. But why is that? Why move in that direction? Again, the easy answer is money, but let's dig a little bit deeper. Over the last few decades, the price of game development skyrocketed. Teams grew from 20 people in a crowded office working on a PS1 game to teams of hundreds of people across multiple floors of an office building, all working on one PS5 game. Now, the budget for the first PlayStation 1 Spider-Man game couldn't have been more than $2 million. And then the game sold almost 2 million copies. So the game made about $55 million on a $2 million budget. So that's a $53 million gross profit on PlayStation 1 sales alone. And that's before we even count the game sales on other consoles. Even if the game flopped on every other console, it wouldn't have mattered, because the game still made back 26 times its budget on PlayStation alone. The rising tide of just one successful game could help lift the boats of all the other games that failed to perform on a comparative level. But things aren't like that in the modern day. So the modern PS5 game made about 8 times as much as the PS1 game, but the PS1 game made back its budget 26 times over, and the PS5 game only made back its budget 2.5 times over. So basically, Spider-Man 2000 helped float a lot of boats. It could float 26 boats. But comparatively, Spider-Man 2 2023 is barely treading water. That's 26 versus 2.5. There's no margin of error to mess up anymore. They have to squeeze every penny they can to try and keep up pace with the rising cost of production. Producing a game for PS5 is almost 150 times as expensive as it was for the original PlayStation. That's 150 times as much risk for only a fraction of the return on investment that you used to get. These companies used to be able to make their money back 20 times over, but now they're barely making it back twice, which means higher stakes with lower returns for investors. But then on the consumer end of it, we're feeling the burn too. Game prices were stagnant for almost 30 years. From the 90s all the way up until the 2020s, things were mostly the same. For almost 3 decades, game prices didn't rise with inflation like everything else did. They were kept artificially stagnant by a bunch of insider trading mumbo jumbo. So that means the price hikes from 60 on PS4 to 70 on PS5 and then 80 on Switch 2, it makes it all feel a lot more sudden and it has a lot more bite for the consumer. And then there's the rumors that GTA 6 might cost $100 at launch. And keep in mind, $60 was the standard for a new game as recently as 5 years ago. Charging $100 for a game makes it feel like they've almost doubled in price. So because games cost more money, less people are buying new games. And because less people are buying new games, less games are being made. And the few games that do get made cost more money to make and make less money than ever before. So the barrier to entry for video games has gotten higher to both play games and to make them. Alright, now we gotta talk about Johnny Consumer. Johnny Consumer just has less time and less money, and because of that, he's playing less games than ever before. And when Johnny does play games, it's pretty rare that he tries something new. He's usually emulating an old PS1 title on his Steam Deck. And when Johnny does try a new game, he's a lot less likely to buy skins or DLC for it, especially if he's already sunk time or money into another game. It's hard to get someone to buy skins in a game like Avengers or Squad if they already have skins in a game like Fortnite. A guy like Johnny is more likely to come back to Fortnite because he already has that sunk cost fallacy of years and years of skin purchases and time spent getting good at that older game. He's already addicted to one dopamine loop, so the next one has to be a lot better to keep his attention in the same way as Fortnite did. I want you to think about that Phil Spencer quote about how Xbox lost the most important generation of game consoles because it was the one where everyone built out their digital libraries. So it's that, but with Fortnite and Marvel rival skins. You can't just make a game, sell it, then coast off the revenue from game sales alone. That formula stopped working over a decade ago. Now they have to open up as many revenue streams as possible. And to do that, they're pulling out every dark pattern and psychological trick in the book. Publishers have to do everything they can because their competition is doing everything they can. It's escalation.
We start wearing Kevlar. They buy armor-piercing rounds.
That's just what the meta is now. The game is evolve or die, and the meta is Moneyball.
What's the problem?
They call it Moneyball.
Moneyball.
Yes.
So Moneyball is this Brad Pitt movie about the 2002 Oakland A's, who were an underdog team that made it to the big leagues thanks to the power of pure math.
Epidemic failure within the game to understand what is really happening. Baseball thinking is medieval. They are asking all the wrong questions. And if I say it to anybody, I'm ostracized.
I'm the last person to ever find anything sports ball related interesting.
Sports.
But this is a great story, and it has a lot to do with everything we've been talking about in terms of dark patterns and dark UI.
This is building in all the intelligence that we have to project players. Stats, the way we read them, will find value in players that nobody else can see.
The movie's all about how Jonah Hill and Brad Pitt use numbers to beat a bunch of old school boomers at baseball.
We are card counters at the blackjack table.
We're gonna turn the odds on the casino.
At its core, it's about optimizing your numbers to make the best out of a bad situation.
There are rich teams and there are poor teams. Then there's 50 feet of crap. And then there's us. Unfair game. If we try to play like the Yankees in here, we will lose to the Yankees out there.
Well, that sounds like fortune cookie wisdom to me.
The way Jonah Hill and Brad Pitt played baseball was so efficient that more prominent teams started copying the way they did things the very next year. And those bigger teams did it with more money and even greater levels of success. So because one team played Moneyball, now every team has to play Moneyball just to keep up.
Escalation.
This is threatening not just a way of doing business, but really what it's threatening is their livelihood. It's threatening their jobs. It's threatening the way that they do things.
We start carrying semi-automatics, they buy automatics.
And every time that happens, whether it's a government or a way of doing business or whatever it is, people who are holding the reins have their hands on the switch. They go batshit crazy.
We start wearing Kevlar, they buy armor-piercing rounds.
Anybody who's not tearing their team down and rebuilding it using your model, they're dinosaurs.
That means the game of baseball now is a fundamentally different game compared to what it was in the early 2000s before Moneyball. This happens a lot in sports, and it happens in video games too. Something changes, a new piece of gear, a new shoe, a new rule, and it completely changes the meta of the entire game. Kind of like how alpha flies are banned in marathons, or how restrictor plate racing grew in NASCAR. For my fellow neck-bearded kinfolk out there, it's why they ban Meta Knight in brawl tournaments. But the same way metas evolve for games, they also evolve for businesses. Businesses like game development especially. In video games, there tends to be a huge shakeup every console generation. So every 5 to 8 years, the whole industry just gets completely turned on its head. You know how I said game prices were almost stagnant for like 30 years? With the cost of production rising so rapidly, publishers put more and more pressure on developers to open up as many revenue streams as possible. That way the publisher could supercharge their ROI. So that leads to pay-to-win mechanics, horse armor, battle passes, loot boxes, all of that stuff. It's all Moneyball. If you haven't caught on yet, Moneyball is kind of my theory of everything for why things are the way they are.
It's about getting things down to one number.
Why do you make default skins ugly on purpose? Because it makes people pay for the good-looking skins. Why does Squad not have an ending? Because if the game had an ending, then people would stop playing. Why do these companies use psychological tricks that prey on people's chemical impulses as a way to extract their attention for as long as possible, as often as possible? And why are they doing that to children? Clearly, it's Moneyball. But getting back to video games, why do they hire consulting firms like SweetBaby to try and cater their products to investment firms like BlackRock instead of their customers, so they can get more investment money, so they can play more Moneyball? So now you have a game industry that's making less games than ever, and the few games they do make are exponentially more streamlined and less experimental. They make a lot of Call of Duty, but they don't make anything like Katamari. With less games being made and games being more generally expensive, publishers feel like they have to add in these Moneyball multipliers to make sure they turn a profit on the few games they do make.
Come on, Swim. Don't you think this is all a bit much? Besides, stuff like Blender, Unreal Engine, and Unity, all those tools are more accessible and easier to learn than ever before. So if more people than ever have the skill sets to make these games, then why are they getting more expensive to make?
Well, at its core, En-What-ification.
You what-ificated?
There are two things at the heart of inefficiency: bureaucracy and middlemen. And every person involved in production between point A and point B, they all cost additional revenue. Everyone takes a little off the top, no matter how much or how little they do. And everyone's piece of the pie is not distributed fairly. So executives, producers, marketers, researchers, HR people, lawyers, office managers, landlords, insurance agents. You have all these people who aren't even remotely involved in the creative process, but all that still costs money. And the bigger a production is, the more of that stuff gets tacked onto it. So the dark-sided opposite to Moneyball would be En-What-ification. That's why Chef Ramsay says don't order the steak at a fish restaurant. The bigger the menu is, the worse the restaurant tends to be. Being a jack of all trades makes you a master of none. Like, you know how a pre-built PC will come loaded with bloatware you don't want or need? Or how Facebook adding one new feature seems to break older parts of the website? Or how phones get worse and worse every additional software update? That's En-What-ification. There are lots of people who do as little work as possible while trying to stretch out the job as long as they can. Now, this isn't everyone, and it's not even the majority of people, but it's still shockingly common to see people like this in the workplace. And the bigger a project is, the more of those people you're gonna have to deal with. And having to work around obstinate coworkers while playing HR waiting games, that's a big part of why these products take so long to get made.
They would just ask for the dumbest, craziest bullshit. Every shape, every bush, every every cloud, every puddle, they'd be like, that's shaped like a dick.
Asking, should we do this? I'm not sure. Let's have a meeting.
They gotta find these problems, even if they don't exist. That's their job, is to like see dicks where dicks don't exist.
People would want to have a meeting to discuss something, and those were the very people who would say, we have too many meetings. I can't get any work done.
You're like, is that a secret dick? I'd be like, no.
Oh my
That's
God.
a carrot. They'd find double entendres where there were no double entendres constantly.
I asked for a very simple combat aggression code to be added and came back with an estimate of 4 weeks. The code I asked for was very simple. I've written it before, would take about 45 minutes. Walk me through what you're gonna do. And he goes, you don't understand. And I was like, I've coded this 3 times. Walk me through it. And he wouldn't. He left angry. Lead programmer came back, started yelling at me, saying, if he says he needs 4 weeks, he needs 4 weeks. And I'm like, then I will do it. I'll have it done before lunch. And he said, no, because then people will have to support your code. I'm like, well, I'm gonna walk you through what I want. And you tell me why this takes 4 weeks. He looked at what I wrote, which was about 10 lines of pseudocode on a whiteboard, and he goes, I'll come back. He came back about an hour later and said, what about 2 weeks? And I said, do I have any options here? Fine. 2 weeks.
That's how 45 minutes of work becomes a 2-week process. The bigger these games get, the more that En-What-ification just compounds on itself. So it's this war between gambling on Moneyball multipliers versus the risk of overdoing it, and then that backfiring and ruining whatever potential the product had in the first place. And the reason they take that risk is that these executives have it in their heads that a $200 million loss is more acceptable than a $2 million profit. It's all in or nothing all the time, and it's unsustainable. So the goal stops being build a good game and then factor in Moneyball multipliers later, and the goal becomes building a game around those Moneyball factors instead, and doing it in a way that incentivizes the player to spend as much time and money on the game as possible. You do all that in hopes of getting the player hooked on a dopamine loop. Okay, here's an example of what I mean by that. Old Town Road famously only has 2 choruses, but most other songs have 3. Only having 2 choruses tricks your brain into wanting to hear that chorus for a 3rd time once the song ends, and then that makes you listen to the song twice because your brain feels like it didn't finish the song. The way the song is written tricks your brain into wanting another hit. And if you listen to the song twice, that means Lil Nas X doubles the stream count and doubles his revenue.
Spotify doesn't necessarily reward good music, it rewards repeatable music. Artists and labels quickly realized this. So now it's not about making the best song, it's about making the best streamable one.
So that's the same Moneyball train of logic behind Squad not having a proper ending. If the game had a proper ending, you'd stop playing the game and wouldn't buy any of the post-launch content. So because of that, the game just doesn't have an ending, that way you'll want to hear the chorus again. Or at least that's how it would work if the song didn't suck. That's the theory anyway. Whether or not it works in practice is up in the air. But my point is, the goal stops being make a good game and it becomes build a good casino. Then step 2 of the goal, you get the player addicted to that dopamine loop, and then the studio can just milk that whale wallet dry. I've been talking about this for years now. I talked about it back in my Marvel mobile games video, how stuff like dopamine drip, gambling mechanics get targeted towards kids in mobile games just so they can sell more loot boxes. And in my Avengers video, I talked about how kids will bully each other and peer pressure ends up being a factor that persuades these kids to spend more money on these stupid skins. And then in my Spider-Man 2 video, I talked about the Adidas suit and all these weird influencer skins. But those aren't the only Moneyball multipliers. They can re-release Game of the Year editions, can do battle passes or other types of DLC. There's product placement, merchandise, Funkos, t-shirts, tie-in comics, or they can start taking investment money from firms like BlackRock. Then they gas their ESG scores to try and manipulate those investment firms' stock picking algorithms into pumping more money into their companies and their projects. Did you just say ESG scores? Alright, it's my turn now. So what are ESG scores? Well, we've been talking about it in hushed tones the entire video, so here's a guy that's a little bit more direct.
The answer? BlackRock, a shadowy $10 trillion multinational investment corporation. 6K companies run everything. Well, BlackRock gives companies something called an ESG score, which determines whether or not they can get funding, whether interest rates and loan terms are, all that kind of stuff. And while it includes a lot of factors, let's focus on the relevant one here, which is that you can improve your ESG score by hiring consulting companies aligned with BlackRock's preferred social and political views. So what? BlackRock's progressive. Isn't that good? Except they're not. They're wearing the skin suit of progress. You want to guess what's conspicuously absent in all of the heavy-handed social messaging? Analysis of wealth inequality. Criticism of rigged economic and legal systems. Any depictions of people putting aside ideological differences and working together to overthrow a corrupt system. Instead, the messaging that we get shoved down our throats is a bunch of hyper-atomized, hyper-individualized pandering to, everyone individually, saying you're perfect, but everyone else hates you. That means you gotta fight against everyone else. I wonder why that could be.
Have to force behaviors, and at BlackRock we are forcing behaviors.
One of my first video games.
Sorry. One of my first video games was Spider-Man 2000 for PS1, and the back cover had a simple but effective tagline. You don't just play it, you live it. But that dream is lost on the Squad game. It's like Swim said in the last video. The game doesn't happen to the Squad, it happens around them. And I blame a lot of that on SweetBaby. Now, you probably heard a lot about ESG or DEI out there on the streets, and your mom and I are so sorry about that. You should have heard it at home, from us first. It's our fault, really. You probably got fed some bad information by some misleading grifters, or you got lost in the culture war sauce. And that's okay, really. We all get misled from time to time. Now, there's maybe a kernel of truth to what they're saying, but that rabbit pellet of truth gets obscured by their go woke, go broke culture war bullshit. Because it's not about diversity quotas or Lizzo in Star Wars. Even though, yeah, I will admit that was kind of dumb.
The companies have been wading into cultural issues and taking what seems to be a left-leaning stance. Well, they see it and think that it's disingenuous, that it's somehow being done for profit. And it is. They're thinking that maybe this is being done because it's going to resonate with the majority of their consumers and they're going to sell more products. And that is not the reason.
What this is really about is BlackRock and the World Economic.
Quick, before they find me, BlackRock owns most United States banks. They own all major pharma companies and mainstream media.
BlackRock is basically the most successful hedge fund there is.
They oversee 10% of all stocks traded worldwide.
They manage the most assets of any hedge fund.
They manage over $10 trillion in assets, which is half of the United States GDP.
As an institutional investor, is the largest institutional investor.
BlackRock and Vanguard own 18% of Fox, 16% of CBS, 13% of Comcast, which also controls NBC, MSNBC, CNBC, Sky News, and they own 12% of Disney. They are the biggest institutional investors of Google, Facebook, Amazon, and now they're buying up all the homes and artificially inflating your mortgage so you will own nothing and be happy. I have to go.
It's about a needle of truth in a haystack of lies. The go woke, go broke shit slingers, they're useful idiots for corporocratic elites. They're controlled opposition. The way they misconstrue the narrative helps obfuscate an inconvenient truth about bait and switch performative activism. Have you ever heard of environmental offsetting? So the concept is that it's okay for a company to burn down part of the Amazon rainforest as long as they replant twice as many trees somewhere else in another part of the world. That's environmental offsetting. It's taking the problem and moving it somewhere else. So in the same vein of environmental offsetting, what ESG scores are is diversity offsetting. It means if a company isn't diverse enough, then they can just hire a consulting firm that is diverse enough. Then on paper, it makes your company look more diverse than they actually are. What I just described is what SweetBaby is, an ESG DEI consulting firm for BlackRock. So you hire SweetBaby, your ESG score goes up, and then you can get more investment money from BlackRock. BlackRock being the investment firm that pretty much runs the entire fucking world. So here's an example of how BlackRock encourages social messaging that doesn't really actually mean anything. In Action Comics 1051 from 2023, you have John Henry, or Steele, giving this speech where he waxes poetic about all these green, eco-friendly, progressive talking points, but it's all just words. There's no real context to the story that really backs any of it up, and nothing he talks about here ever gets brought up again. The comic isn't about a flood or an environmental disaster, it's about a kryptonite robot guy being mind controlled. None of the stuff he mentioned ever comes up again. It doesn't add anything to the story, there's no Chekhov's gun to it, it's just padding. He just says, this stuff is bad and this stuff is good. And because the book pushes those BlackRock aligned values, that makes their ESG score go up. They don't have to actually do anything, it doesn't have to actually mean anything, they just have to say it. Then right-wing people get triggered and left-wing people feel validated. All the while, the corporocratic elites get to feel good about lining their pockets with blood money, pretending to be the world's saviors, without ever actually doing anything. And don't get it twisted, global warming is a problem that we should all be worried about. Being environmentally conscious is a good thing. We should take better care of the planet. And I think representation and diversity are important too. But we need to do the right things in the right ways for the right reasons. ESG scores don't solve any problems. They just take the problem and move it somewhere else. It's offsetting. Their priorities are still misplaced. They're just using a glitch in the system to get around us noticing it. They're paying an inconvenience fee instead of putting in the work to affect real positive change in the world. All this pandering bullshit doesn't actually do anything. It's armchair activism where people talk about the things they should be doing instead of actually doing them, and then they pretend that's real progress. But words without action are meaningless. And on the opposite side of the political spectrum, you have all these painfully misguided neoconservative grifters who are still going off about black women in Star Wars. The word that comes to mind is useful idiot. They turn the debate into something so stupid that it polarizes people to two opposite sides of the spectrum.
You don't like woke stuff being pushed in Marvel movies? You're a Nazi, dude!
Fucking pronouns! Fucking gender ambiguity!
When Captain Marvel came out, they said the battleground for this dumb cultural dispute should be gay comic book movies. That's the bellwether of who's winning the culture war.
What a terrible time to be alive.
Yeah.
It distracts and hides the core of what ESG and DEI actually are and why they exist. It's manipulation through obfuscation. They set up the right and the left to go at each other's throats, while BlackRock helps the elites make their moves in silence. It brainwashes people on the left and the right and makes them fight each other instead of fighting for any actual meaningful change to the status quo or your fellow man's quality of life and standard of living, which makes BlackRock that much more influential and gives them that much more control over the world from the shadows. So BlackRock doesn't technically own everything, but they own just enough shares of everything to influence nearly every noteworthy company imaginable. When BlackRock talks, every company across the world listens.
Can write a shareholder letter to the board of directors of every company and say, here's our priorities and we need you to follow along with these, or we're going to reconsider our investment in you. And that actually is a substantial threat, because if you have 10% of your stock dumped, that'll crash your price.
And owning an influencing share of stock in nearly every major company, while also owning the stock picking algorithm that all the other investment funds use to pick their stocks, that means BlackRock can create self-fulfilling prophecies by stacking the odds in their favor.
He has this overpowered tool in Aladdin. So Aladdin is a machine learning algorithm. It's an AI. They've got an AI stock picker that vacuums up data through all of its partner companies and through the companies that it's invested heavily in. Aladdin is a subscription service to other investors. So if you're another hedge fund, you can use Aladdin. And Aladdin is so good at predicting what stocks to buy and what stocks to sell that people basically take its calls without questioning them. So many other hedge funds follow the advice of Aladdin that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a proven winner already.
They have the best analysts, the best PR people, the best networking. They have news organizations and governments and politicians all on their side. I'm not kidding when I say every government retirement fund is run through BlackRock. They can influence and control the media in ways that were hitherto undreamt of. Remember in Winter Soldier, when Zola said that the internet was a book and that you just needed to know how to read it? Well, BlackRock doesn't just know how to read it. They wrote the damn book. And the theory that they place their bets on, it doesn't always align with the best interests of what the masses actually want or need. It all just aligns with the special interests of the elites. So to break down the simplest layer, ESG scores are the carrot and low stock evaluations are the stick. So if you want more investment money, then you need a higher ESG score. So to get a higher ESG score, you hire SweetBaby. On the surface, it might look like all SweetBaby is doing is just taking out some edgy jokes or altering some over-sexualized character designs, but what their actions actually result in is overcorrection. It turns every Spider-Man 2 mission into Captain Planet. It's like how old cartoons used to end every episode with a PSA.
Now we know! Knowing is half the battle!
But we're not talking about 30 seconds at the end of an episode. These are entire half-hour-long side missions.
That's no good!
These games all feel like they were put through an HR filter, and that's because they were. That's what SweetBaby is, an overcorrective HR filter.
They own the advertisers, so it's something the advertisers don't want you to say. It's not something YouTube wants you to say. So therefore the YouTubers don't say it, and everybody watching doesn't hear it.
They gotta find these problems, even if they don't exist. That's their job, is to like see dicks where dicks don't exist.
SweetBaby worked on Squad, Gotham Knights, and Spider-Man 2. And I think Spider-Man 2 had the most awkward example of this kind of integration. And it goes beyond that one mission where you play as a deaf girl. It's about all the accessibility options in the game. Do you ever feel like video games are dumbed down compared to what they used to be? Like, you know the yellow paint meme that everyone talks about? Well, that's SweetBaby 2. And what about the Bee minigame? Or the side missions where you race around on those bikes while scientists yap in your ear about global warming? And again, global warming is important. I'm just saying there's a time and a place for everything. And the time and place for Greta Thunberg is not in my Spider-Man 2 video game.
How dare you?
None of this weird awkward filler serves the plot of the game at all. It just distracts from it. It's not like Kraven and Venom are trying to destroy the environment in the game. That's not the point of why this is here. They just have to find a way to plug all these buzzwords into the script. That way it'll raise their ESG score and they can get more investment money. They don't actually have to do anything, and it doesn't even have to mean anything. All they have to do is talk about it. These missions pretty much only exist so that they can check off checks on a checklist for BlackRock's AI stock picking algorithm. Remember how the #1 complaint for the first Spider-Man game was the MJ missions and all the hacking mini games that were so bad that they literally gave you an option to skip them? Well, those are what every single one of the ESG side missions feel like. They don't complement the other layers of the Spider-Man 2 experience. None of these missions have anything to do with Kraven or Venom or Peter or Miles. Just think about all the stuff that got cut. All the symbiotes, the scrap DLC. Think about how they had to rush development on this thing to get the game out the door in time for the holiday season. And then I want you to realize The B missions, the Haley level, those were the things that didn't get cut. Those side missions took priority and had to stay in the game so that Sony, Insomniac, and Marvel could all moneyball their ESG scores and get some more of that sweet, sweet BlackRock money. And keep in mind, SweetBaby is the one company that we know the most about in the one industry where information is most readily available. There are all kinds of consulting firms, just like SweetBaby, and they exist in film, TV, games, books, social media. Any industry imaginable has these types of people. I want you to look up the McKinsey Group and all the controversies that are associated with them. The overcorrection and shitification problem is everywhere. And that's what irritates me when people like the Critical Drinker talk about SweetBaby, because they never talk about the BlackRock of it. There's never any depth to what they're saying. All they do is distract from the real reasons that these games and shows suck. And being that loud and obnoxious lets Disney handwave away any criticism as toxic fan base is toxic. It gives them a straw man to defend themselves against and distract from the other real issue. But the real sinister thing here is how the debate becomes so polarized that people on the left end up co-opting BlackRock's messaging without even realizing it. And that polarization makes people on the left feel obligated to defend Disney for some reason. They just assume it's a lesser of two evils when they don't even know what the debate is actually about. And on the subject of DEI, the reason I say ESG and not DEI is that I think ESG is always a bad thing. But DEI, I kind of think DEI can be a good thing if it's used the right way. But it can also be a bad thing if it's misused. It's nuanced. So diversity is good, but tokenization is bad. Miles Morales was a great game from a black perspective.
The exaggerated swagger of a black teen.
But Spider-Man 2 just had Miles doing a whole lot of bullshit that didn't really mean anything to anyone. The Miles Morales game was a great example of diversity and representation. It's a slice of life game and it has a great vibe. You're exploring Miles' place in his community, what his friends are like, his neighborhood, his lifestyle, and it only worked because Insomniac hired an authentically diverse crew of people who had lived the kind of lifestyle that they wanted to emulate in the game through Miles. But the problem is that most of the people that worked on the Miles game got laid off after the game dropped. They didn't get carried over to work on Spider-Man 2. So when Spider-Man 2 came out, all that authenticity from the Miles game was missing. Case in point, Miles had the Cuban flag instead of the Puerto Rican one hanging up in his apartment. And keep in mind, one of Miles' suits in the game literally is the Puerto Rican flag. So Miles Morales is filled with all this authenticity, and then Spider-Man 2 has none of it. Miles hangs out with Peter, he gets ignored by Peter, he has all these school missions, and then he goes on missions where he learns about black history through stolen museum exhibits. The game stops being about Miles helping out his neighborhood bodega, and it turns into Miles awkwardly explaining the history of some old trumpet after getting it back from a bunch of art thieves. The game stops being about Miles living his own life, and it ends up with Miles being used as a tool to learn about someone else's. In his own game, Miles has a childhood friend that goes down a path that turns them into a criminal on the run from the law, and that puts the lives of Miles and everyone he loves in danger. It's not exactly Boys in the Hood, but that's the idea, but on a level that kids can understand. I think Ironheart kind of had the same vibe. Good girl finds some bad influences and gets wrapped up in the world of crime. So Miles Morales has this big story with a lot of stuff for Miles to do, but then in Spider-Man 2, Miles gets left unread by Peter and he has to write an essay. One of these things is not like the other. The Miles game was way more authentic, but Spider-Man 2 doesn't feel authentic at all. It feels like Uncanny Valley whitewashed diversity offsetting. So when DEI is used right, in an authentic manner, we get unique experiences like the first Miles game, or projects like Echo and Prey. But then at its worst, DEI is just performative activism that doesn't really mean anything and doesn't really do anything. Remember when I talked about pinkwashing or greenwashing in my comic commercials video? Like how Disney will pander to gay audiences domestically and then remove those gay characters in their scenes from movies. That way they can release them overseas in China or Saudi Arabia.
One word and one word alone. Racism!
A few years ago, I got a little bit triggered by the Black Widow movie and wanted to make a video about how Chinese censorship policies affect American media. Taskmaster's helmet, which is usually a skull in the comics, was changed into this weird knight helmet thing for the movies. The reason for that was they consider skulls offensive.
You're right, this is racist.
But the way that American movie studios pander to Chinese audiences doesn't stop with Taskmaster's helmet being changed. Let's go a little bit deeper. Sentiments of racism towards black people are extremely prevalent amongst the citizens of mainland China. For the Chinese release of Star Wars Episode 7, Finn was completely removed from the Chinese poster. And for the Chinese release of Black Panther, nearly all the posters covered up Chadwick Boseman's face. What you can't do is ignore the small ripples and butterfly effects that these things have on the media that we consume. But the way that Disney panders so heavily with their first gay characters every few months is beyond frustrating. And have you ever noticed that anytime an LGBT character shows up in a Disney product, they're always just in the background, like in Eternals? They shoot it in a way that they can kind of recontextualize it and repurpose it for foreign audiences. Think about the two lesbians in Sailor Moon, and then how the American Toonami version of it made them cousins. Are you familiar with the concept of pinkwashing or greenwashing? When a company or a brand releases a product saying that a portion of the proceeds go to charity, but it's not really a charity thing, it's really more of a marketing thing? That's basically what Disney is doing with representation. So you have all these articles that are written about how progressive Disney is for including 2 lesbians kissing in the background of a scene that they cut out of the movie for Chinese and Middle Eastern audiences. The fact that LGBT characters are only bit parts or background characters, that feels frustrating to me. And then Disney claims it's progress. It's completely hypocritical. That's why this stuff matters. Where they sell their products, who their investors are, all of that matters. This all impacts how the movies are made. So when you hear me complaining about ESG scores, what I'm complaining about is that Disney is basically greenwashing, pinkwashing, profiting off of LGBT culture. It's soft erasure, and then they claim it's progress. And if you try and fight against it, they claim you're the problem. Just try to understand that even if you think I'm wrong, even if you think I'm misguided, I'm trying to approach it from the right direction and for the right reason. So you know how companies use charity as a marketing thing? The term that comes to my mind is pinkwashing. A company will come out with some special edition pink product, they say it's in the name of breast cancer awareness, and then they keep the majority of the profit while donating the bare minimum to charity. And DC does something very similar, albeit just a little less scummy. It's called a bait and switch, or a bat and switch. I call it bat washing. And like greenwashing or pinkwashing, it's a marketing thing. So Batman will show up for like 1 page or a couple of panels, or like 30 seconds in the background of a cartoon. And then DC will try and ham up that cameo as more than it is. They'll put Batman on the cover of the book, on the cover of the DVD. They basically try and trick people into thinking it's a Batman project, that way they can move more product. And it worked so well for the animated Flashpoint movie that they put the most popular Batman of the 80s in their Hollywood Flash movie just a few years later, in hopes of recreating that same bat washing effect. And that's kind of what the Squad game did with the Arkham franchise. They made this new thing, and then they disguised it as a Batman sequel. And that's also 100% what I did with the last video, and maybe a little bit what I'm doing with this video. So I named the last video Dead Arkham Theory, because I knew that more people would click on a video about the Batman games than they would the flop Squad game. But pinkwashing, greenwashing, environmental offsetting. At its core, all this stuff is just bait and switch performative activism. It's capitalism disguising itself as charity. And that's how stuff like DEI and ESG scores get misused and abused. Sometimes we call it race baiting, sometimes we call it queer baiting, whitewashing, greenwashing. We can call it whatever you want. The problem here is that you have all these people who are misguided by their own good intentions, and that leads to overcorrection. And that overcorrection has directly led us to horseshoe theory. In their attempt to promote diversity and equality, they accidentally turned race into a number that can be calculated and manipulated. They turned people into a statistic, and then they treated that statistic like a monolith. They tried so hard to not be racist that they circled back around to outright racism. And that's exactly what happened with SweetBaby Games and the developers of Black Myth Wukong. It was a Chinese game by Chinese developers about a Chinese myth where you play as the Chinese Monkey King. And I cannot stress this enough, this game was as culturally Chinese as it can get. And the developers wanted to tell that story in an authentic way.
Go ahead and speak a little Chinese for them,
But then they got contacted by SweetBaby. SweetBaby was like, hey, your Chinese studio isn't culturally diverse enough. There's only Chinese people working here. They got told that only having Chinese people working on the Chinese game in China was somehow racist. They said that Western audiences demand diversity, and that if they didn't work with SweetBaby, those mean gaming websites like IGN and Kotaku, well, they just might have to write some articles about the game and how the developers are toxic. You know, maybe the easiest solution would be to work with SweetBaby. That way you can offset your diversity quota. Now let me spin that from another perspective. The mobsters said, hey, you know, this is our territory. You're gonna have to pay us some protection money, or else IGN and Kotaku, they might have to say you're racist, and you don't want them to say you're racist, do you? But the developers didn't bend the knee. They looked SweetBaby and BlackRock sternly in the face and said,
China number one. China number one. China number one.
China number one. China number one. China number one. And then the story had a complete Streisand effect, and the smear campaign completely backfired. People actually ended up rallying to support Wukong because of the controversy. And it kind of exposed and implied that SweetBaby had been doing this to Western developers as well. All the Western game companies were too afraid of BlackRock to actually say anything. But it didn't matter because the jig was up. The idea was that you pay SweetBaby $7 million and then you hope that BlackRock will multiply that investment. This scandal exposed and explained a lot of things at once. It explained why Spider-Man 2 had all that weird posturing with the ESG side missions. And it also explained why the Saints Row remake was the way it was too. It was sort of a theory of everything for cringy video game writing. So yeah, there are pros and cons to this stuff existing, and whether or not it's the lesser of two evils, whether or not the ends justify the means, that's up to you to decide for yourself. But it does exist, and pretending it doesn't, or pretending it doesn't impact the media that gets made, is absurd. You had Western anti-racist policies being abused to try and extort a culturally Chinese studio into paying money to international investors. Just textbook horseshoe theory in action. They tried so hard to not be racist that they overcorrected, went full circle, came back around, and did something extremely racist. None none of this stuff is as black and white as either side of the political spectrum would have you believe. When DEI is used right, it's an excuse to try new things. I think one of the best examples of DEI done right is Echo. A lot of people talk about how Echo didn't really get a good marketing push, and neither did Ironheart, and Echo kind of all got dropped at once. In Ironheart, I think it was released in 2 batches across 2 weeks. Eyes of Wakanda, that's another one that was released all at once. But that's not how they do the other shows. What If and Loki, they have week-to-week drops, because they have a week-to-week marketing budget. Ironheart and Echo don't. All that is to say, I really like Ironheart and I really like Echo. But the reason that Echo works is because they actually did the work of hiring authentic voices that had lived the real-life world experiences that they wanted to portray in the show. They hired Native Americans and deaf people, and that made Echo feel a lot more sincere, and that sincerity is everything. It was sincere to the Marvel Universe, and it was sincere to Native American culture. A double whammy. That's why Echo hit, that's why Ironheart hit, and it's why Black Panther hit. There's a whole history of right-wing Trump supporters like Ike Perlmutter trying to block movies about characters like Captain Marvel and Black Panther from even being made. So with people like that in the room, you kind of need DEI initiatives to force these ideas through the door. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's always a gamble. I don't think you get a show about a deaf girl or about Native American culture set in the MCU if it wasn't for these DEI initiatives. And I also think it's worth noting, it's not like they decided to make Ironheart instead of Ghost Rider or Moon Knight Season 2. If your problem is that we got Ironheart instead of something else, then your problem isn't with Ironheart, your problem is that we didn't get something else. But to get back on topic, there's no way in hell that a show like Echo gets made unless you have a DEI initiative that helps grease the wheels a little bit and gives them an incentive to make that show. These aren't shows that they expect to perform on the same level as Daredevil. What they're looking for is niche hits. You kind of need the incentive for studios to take a risk on a new idea. But if it means we get something like Black Panther or something like Ironheart or Echo, or even Prey, I think that gamble is worth it. Shows like Watchmen come to mind. A ton of people didn't even know about the Tulsa race massacres until they watched that show. And obviously Wakanda isn't real, but there are layers of authenticity that they draw from, and that helps the myth of Wakanda feel more real. Any good liar will tell you. The key to a good lie is that there has to be a little bit of truth sprinkled in. And it's the same thing for fiction. You need that kernel of authenticity to sell it, to make it feel real and hold weight. So all this stuff on screen, these are all great examples of DEI being used in the right way. But then when it's at its worst, you just get stuff like Shang-Chi and Eternals. Movies that look progressive on the surface, but don't actually say anything meaningful. The stuff they put in Shang-Chi wasn't faithful to the comic or to Chinese culture. So when they released it in China, the audiences sniffed that out and met the movie with a resounding, no thank you. So DEI, when it's done right, it does a lot for disenfranchised voices in a positive way. But when you treat it like a number on a spreadsheet, you get movies like Shang-Chi or Eternals that don't actually say anything and don't actually mean anything. This stuff doesn't work if there's no depth or no layers of authenticity. It's not enough to just rush an Asian-themed product out the door with a Chinese coat of paint on it. That stuff doesn't work because there's no depth, there's no layer of authenticity to it. If there's a lack of authenticity, it's never going to click with Asian people in the same way that Black Panther did with Black people. And look, if you can't even draw in the audience that you're trying to pander to, then there's no chance that wider demographics are going to give your product the time of day either. And like I said before, all this stuff is way more nuanced than either side of the aisle wants to admit. I just hate that every time someone talks about SweetBaby or ESG or DEI, it always turns into ginger side and white erasure. That's not what this video is about. All those guys sound like this to me.
I'm Steve. No! I am Steve! He's not even black! He got black in his name, but he's not black! Steve is a nigga! And as you can see, I'm a nigga!
Now that guy was obviously doing a bit, but every time a popular character gets recast or rebooted into a black guy, everyone on Twitter loses their mind. So Quentin Tarantino likes to rant about how movies were edgy back in the 70s, then they got all lame, PC, and family-friendly during the Reagan era in the 80s, but then in the 90s, movies got edgy again.
Looks like things are getting all PC again. Lasted about 6 years last time. We got at least 5.9 years to go.
If we're so worried about protecting the kids from violence and sexuality and edgy humor, if the whole point is to scream protect the children, then why don't we apply that same energy towards protecting kids from gambling? What about the Marvel superhero slot machine on your baby cousin's iPad? Why doesn't that concern you? They're willing to take everything out of these video games except for the gambling mechanics. They'll take away sexy costumes, they'll take away edgy jokes, they'll take away blood and violence, but they don't take away the gambling mechanics. The weirdest thing about seeing this culture of overcorrection rise up is that it's directly mirrored by the rise and normalization of sports betting and gambling culture. So some of the motivations for this stuff might be new, but ESG, DEI, everything SweetBaby's doing, it's all just an evolution of a very old playbook. A great example of this happening in the past would be Tipper Gore and the Filthy 15. The cultural cycle of edgy humor versus PC culture, we've always done this, but it's undeniable that Trump has had a big impact on that cultural cycle. I think he made it stretch out longer in some ways, and he also made people overcorrect twice as hard in others, but it's still just a cultural cycle. We can already see companies starting to slowly roll back or slow down their DEI and ESG initiatives, specifically because of Trump administration policies. With the cyclical nature of this stuff, it doesn't change the past. It doesn't change the games that those programs interfered with or ruined. It doesn't make Spider-Man 2 any less awkward, and it doesn't just magically restore game studios that went under because of these bullshit policies. When these cycles end, people don't just magically get their jobs back. The games don't just magically get better. We end up having to deal with the fallout from it for a long time. So if you're wondering, hey, wasn't this supposed to be a video about comic book video games? Well, yeah, that was the original intention, but somewhere along the way, it kind of became a video about why all those games suck instead. So across 5 different videos, this was the conclusion I reached. It's not just one answer. It's not just one thing. It's a death by 1,000 cuts. It's a mix of Moneyball, En-What-ification, min-maxing, corporate greed, and above all else, BlackRock, venture capital, and institutional investing. That's at the core of why comic book video games are the way they are. Explaining why things are the way they are, that's also the point of the hypercrisis theory. And on this channel, almost every video is guided by that one fan theory. Once you view comic continuity in the greater context of the third hypercrisis, you can't unsee it. It's a way of explaining why things are the way they are in the world of comic books. 2 roads diverge in a linear timeline, and sorry you could not travel them both? I'll let you know what lies at the end of each. The first is the hypercrisis playlist, a playlist full of dangerous ideas, info hazards, and bizarre fan theories. The second is a playlist of comic game videos, including some of my own and a ton of other YouTubers. If you want to see more videos about lost comic games, then check out Diego Reviews. He has a ton of videos on comic mobile games that would have been lost to time if it wasn't for fan preservation. But also, that playlist isn't just comic video games. The point of this video was to explain why comic games suck, and you can't do that without getting into the inside baseball of Moneyball, venture capital, and institutional investing. So that playlist has a ton of videos about BlackRock, modern game development, and the rise of gambling in Silicon Valley tech culture. Pretty much any video that I clipped or any video that inspired the thoughts inside of this video is in that playlist. There are videos from people like More Perfect Union, CoffeeZilla, Good Work, Nerd City, Flesh Simulator, Nakey Jakey, Drew Gooden, and watching their videos is like putting together pieces of a grander puzzle. So if you want to figure out the pieces for yourself, this is me citing my sources. And I just want to say, I don't 100% sponsor or endorse everything in every video, but if I put them in this playlist, it's because I think that video is worth checking out. Because even if I disagree with the guy who made it, there's probably some kernel of truth to 10% of what they're saying, even if the other 90% is drastically exaggerated in the wrong direction. That playlist also has my last video on the Arkhamverse, and a video on my second channel reviewing Ironheart, talking about the performative outrage around both of those projects. Because, again, DEI is a lot like a gun, and the gun, just like the DEI, it's not inherently good or evil. It's just a tool. A gun doesn't determine the morality of the situation. It's the person holding it, where they point it, and why.